In the long history of world, there has been movement that push humanity to brink. But for the 13 days in October 1962, we did not just stand on the brink. We stood on precipice of total annihilation, starting on the abyss of full-scale nuclear war. It was confrontation that pitted two of the most powerful men of Earth against each other, a high-stake chess match where the pawns were nuclear warhead and the price of failure was civilization itself. It all started with a photograph, a grainy black and white image taken on October 14th of 1962 from over 70,000 feet in the air by U-2 spy plane. That photo and the ones that followed confirms America was fair. The Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida, and they was not just any missile. They were weapons capable of striking Washington D.C., New York, and dozens of other American cities within minutes. This is the moment-by-moment story of the secret deals, the military calls, and the 13 days that almost ended everything. To understand how the world got to this point, you have to understand the Cold War. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpower, locked in a bitter ideological struggle. The tension was palpable. A year earlier, in 1961, a US-backed attempt to overthrow Cuba, new communist leader Fidel Castro had ended in a humiliating failure at the Bay of Pigs. In the response to this, and to America's Jupiter missile station in Turkey and Italy, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev made a daring move. He struck a secret agreement with Castro to place nuclear missile in Cuba, both to deter another American invasion and to level strategic playing field. Khrushchev thought he could do it secretly, presenting the missile to world as a done deal. He was wrong. On the morning of October 60th, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was shown the U-2 photograph taken 2 days prior. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a quiet rustle of intelligence briefing in the Oval Office. Immediately, Kennedy convened a small secret group of his most trusted advisors. This body, later known as Executive Committee or EXCOM, was tasked with a single terrifying objective: figure out what to do. The options were grim. On the side were the Hawks, including his top military generals, who argued for immediate airstrike to destroy the missile site, to follow by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. On the other side were the Doves, who urged caution, fearing a direct attack would trigger an unstoppable chain reaction leading to a nuclear war. The world continued on oblivious as a handful of men in Washington began debating the fate of humanity. For the next several days, the secret debates raged inside the White House. More U-2 flight revealed even more sites, including some for longer range weapon that expanded the threat profile dramatically. Publicly, Kennedy maintained his normal schedule to avoid causing a panic. He even met with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, who, unaware that US knew the truth, lied to President Face and insisted the weapon in Cuba were purely defensive. Inside XCOM, the pressure to launch a military strike were immense, but Kennedy resisted. He knew that attacking the site risked killing Soviet personnel, an act of war that Khrushchev could not ignore. Instead, Kennedy settled on a middle course, a naval quarantine of Cuba. It was carefully chosen word. A blockade is an act of war. A quarantine sound like a temporary, presentative measure, a distinction that allowed the US to gain support from other nations. It was a move designed to stop more missiles from arriving while giving both sides a silver of room to negotiate. On the evening of October 22nd, John F. Kennedy addressed the American people and world in a televised broadcast. He revealed the existence of Soviet missile in Cuba and announced the naval quarantine. He made the stakes crystal clear. Any missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. Across the globe, the news hit like a shockwave. For the first time, people everywhere truly understood the imminent danger of nuclear war. In the US, civil defense drill began, and the family prepared makeshift fallout shelter. The US military was placed on DEFCON 3, an increased state of readiness. The next 2 days were defined by unbearable tension. A line of American warships took their position, forming a 500-mile arc around Cuba. Soviet freight ships, some likely carrying missile components, steamed directly toward that line. Khrushchev called in quarantine an act of aggression. The world watched as the two superpowers sailed toward a direct confrontation. Then, on October 24th, the first Soviet ship approached the quarantine line and the stop. Some turned back. It was a small but crucial de-escalation, but the crisis was far from over. On the ground in Cuba, construction of missile sites continued at a frantic pace, and the U.S. Strategic Air Command was elevated to DEFCON 2 at the highest alert level ever reached in post-war history, just one step shy of nuclear war. As the standoff at the sea continued, a new unconventional front opened: diplomacy. On the October 26th, an ABC News correspondent, John Scully, was approached by a KGB agent with a back-channel offer. The missile would be removed if the US promised not to invade Cuba. At the same time, a long emotional letter arrived from Khrushchev himself. It repeated the offer to remove the missile from a non-invasion pledge, arguing passionately to avoid mutual destruction. For a moment, it seemed a peaceful resolution was possible, but the situation on ground remained volatile. In Cuba, frustrated Fidel Castro, feeling like a pawn in a superpower game, sent a cable to Khrushchev on October 26, urging him to launch a primitive nuclear strike against the United States if an invasion seemed imminent. On the October 26, 1962 would go down in history as a Black Saturday. It was the single most dangerous day of the Cold War, a day the world came perilously close to the nuclear Armageddon. The day began with the arrival of a second, more aggressive letter from Khrushchev. This time the term had changed. Now he demanded the US remove its Jupiter missile from Turkey in exchange for the Soviet missile in Cuba. Then the situation spiraled out of control. A U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba was shot by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Ederson. He was the only combat fatality of the crisis. American military leaders were incensed, believing it was a deliberate escalation and renewing their demand for immediate retaliation. As if the tension was not high enough, a second U-2 on a routine air sampling mission near Alaska accidentally strayed up deep into Soviet airspace. US Air Force had to decide whether to provide fighter cover for the easily start a dogfight over Siberia. Perhaps the most harrowing close call of all happened beneath the wave. At Soviet submarine, the B-59 was cornered by the US Navy, which was dropping small non-lethal depth charges to signal the submarine crew cut from Moscow was exhausted and panicked, believing war had already started, and captain decided to launch the sub-nuclear torpedo. Launching required the agreement of three senior officers. The captain consented, the political officer consented, but the third, a fleet commander named Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be on board, refused. His long descent prevented a nuclear launch that would have instantly vaporized a US aircraft carrier and triggered an unimaginable response. With the war seeming imminent, President Kennedy made a crucial decision. He chose to ignore Khrushchev's second public demand about the Turkish missile. Instead, he responded only to the first, more conciliatory offer. Publicly, he argued to the non-invasion pledge. Secretly, he sent his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to meet with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrin. In that clandestine meeting, Robert Kennedy delivered a final, a secret part of the deal. The US would indeed remove the missile from Turkey, but it had to be done quietly. Months later, so it would not look like a trade. It was an ultimatum wrapped in a concession. On the morning of October 28, the world awoke to a stunning news broadcast over Moscow radio. Nikita Khrushchev announced the Soviet Union would dismantle the missile site and return to the weapon to USSR. He framed it as a victory for peace, accepting Kennedy's public response not to invade Cuba. The secret part of the deal, the removal of the US missile from Turkey, remained hidden from public for decades. The immediate crisis was over. The Soviet ships returned for home, and in week that followed, that missile launcher were removed from Cuba. On November 20th, the US formally ended the quarantine. The story of Cuban Missile Crisis is a powerful reminder of how close we came to world-ending conflict. It is a lesson in leadership, diplomacy, and terrifying logic on nuclear brinkmanship. If you want to understand more of the pivotal moment that has shaped our modern world, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into history.